Mooses.
All right, good evening, everybody. Today is November 25th, 2024. Today is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. It's 6:03 p.m. and we are live. Before we do our regular legislative meeting, we do have individual committee meetings this evening. I'm going to start with City Properties, Parks, and Recreation. Mr. Cheatham, the chair, is absent, so we'll go to the co-chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is 18:04, and I will not be opening this committee up because we do not have quorum.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Gerhart.
You're welcome.
Excuse me, I'm running behind here. All right, next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to bring the Public Welfare and Safety Committee to order. It is Monday, November 25th, 2024. Time is 18:04 hours. We're in council chambers. All members of my committee are present, including myself as chair. We have Ms. Gerhart, Mr. Greer, and Mr. Cheatham, who is absent. He is our co-chair. All other council members and others are noted on my sheet. We have no requests for legislation, no pending legislation. Do we have any miscellaneous from my committee? Rest of the body? Anybody in the gallery? Can I get a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 18:05.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next up is Rules Market Development with Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Council President. I would like to bring the Rules Marketing and Development Committee to order. It is Monday, November 25th, and the time is 18:05 p.m., and we are in council chambers. All members are present, including myself as chair, Mrs. Beck as co-chair, Mr. Heidig, and President Greer. And everybody else noted on my sheet. We have no new requests for legislation at this time. We do have a pending piece of legislation. It's ordinance 113-2024, and this is approving the CDBG annual action plan, that increased amount of $3,740 for repairing that roof at 185 North Van Buren. Did we have any conversation about this or questions or anything? Okay. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion from my committee? From the body? From the gallery? Seeing none, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. And we are adjourned at 1806. Thank you.
So close. All right, thank you, Ms. Gerhart.
You're welcome.
Next up is City Utilities with Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Utilities, I would like to call this meeting to order today, November 25th. We are in council chambers. The time is 6:07. All members of my committee are present except Mrs. Hager. She is absent. Tonight we have no new requests for legislation and we don't have any pending legislation. Do we have anything from the gallery or from council for discussion for city utilities?
I just wanted to give a reminder that you should not be sweeping leaves into our storm sewers. I actually got a call about this last week, and luckily I don't know Mr. Shreve's back there, but I contacted him, and immediately the next day our street department was out and got it taken care of, but that could cause some serious damage. So if you see it, make sure you make a call on it, because that's not okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. And also, grass, I think grass is worse than leaves, but both of them are bad, so we don't need to be increasing our chances of flooding and stopping up our drain system. So,
And
thank
it
you.
ends up at the treatment
It
plant.
ends up at the,
Yep.
and it breaks the pumps and everything else at the treatment plant.
Yep.
So, thank you. Do we have any more discussion? Yes, Mr. Harris.
I just want to commend those guys for busting their butts, getting the leaves picked up. I know at least in my ward, they've been through at least twice, maybe 3 or 4 times. I haven't babysat them, but they've been doing a good job on that.
Thank you. Yes, I saw them out there on the weekends and whatever they're out there.
Yeah.
That's good. Do we have anything else? If not, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Beck. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:09. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. All right, next up is Finance and Personnel with Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to bring the Finance and Personnel Committee to order. It is Monday, November 25th, 2024, 6:10 PM here in Council Chambers. All members of my committee are present, which includes myself as chair, Mr. Heidig, Mr. Griffin, and President Greer. All other council members are present with the exception of Ms. Hager and Mr. Cheatham, and guests is noted on my sheet. This evening, we will be reading ordinance number 108-2024, title Appropriation Finance Department, an ordinance appropriating $134,497.31 from the unappropriated item of the American Rescue Plan Grant Fund to the capital budget of the American Rescue Plan Grant Fund and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks? Next, we have ordinance 109-2024, title Adopting the AFSCME Agreement, an ordinance of the Council of the City of Barberton adopting and approving the collective bargaining agreement between the City of Barberton and AFSCME Local 265 and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks on this? Moving on, ordinance number 111-2024, title Grant Request, America 250 Ohio Grants Program. This ordinance would approve the submission of a grant request by the mayor to the America 250 Ohio Grants Program to be used for activities being planned in Barberton celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States. Are there any remarks? Next, we have ordinance 112-2024, titled Non-Bargaining Personnel Policy, an ordinance adopting a new non-bargaining personnel policy 2025 and repealing all ordinances in conflict therewith. This did have emergency wording, but we've received a request to remove that, so I want to go ahead and amend that here in committee. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll motion to amend the ordinance to strike emergency language.
Okay, and can I have a second?
I second.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Are there any remarks regarding this piece of legislation? Mr. Harris?
Is this going to 3 readings then? The only reason I ask is because we heard in the past several weeks about parity, and we do know that police negotiations are still ongoing.
Mm-hmm. From my understanding, after talking to our law director, they're not related. However, because we are missing 2 council members, we won't be voting on this evening. So it will go at least 2 readings. Hopefully in that time, the police contracts will be finished. But like I said, after talking with Mrs. Miller, she said, it's apples and oranges. So I don't know if you want to say anything, Mrs. Miller.
Sure. So, as everyone knows, the police contract could not be settled before the end of the year, right? It could go into March. So this has, I know that some people want to tie them together in a way. This has nothing to do with negotiations. As I've explained to several council members, I don't negotiate on behalf of the city for union contracts. I'm the one who requested this based on a comment I received from someone in the fire department. This was the whole point of this. This did not come from anyone trying to do something in negotiations. This was my idea. I had zero interest in the negotiations. So.
Do you have any other questions?
No, I'll save them for later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We also have ordinance 113, 2024. However, I don't believe that belongs on my agenda because it's presented by Miss Gearhart. Yeah. Strike. Yeah, that's okay. You can strike that one out. Then we have ordinance 114-2024, title enter into contract with Delta Dental employee dental coverage. This would authorize the mayor to enter into contract with Delta Dental to provide employee dental coverage beginning January 1st, 2025 through December 31st, 2026. Are there any remarks? Then we have ordinance 115-2024, title amending ordinance 93-2024, appropriation street capital budget. This would amend ordinance 93-2024, appropriation street capital budget to reflect a decrease in the appropriation amount of $500,000 for a total appropriation amount of $53,000 and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks? Okay, and then finally we have ordinance number 116-2024, title appropriation finance department. This would appropriate $447,000 from the unappropriated item of the Infrastructure Improvement Reserve Fund to the capital budget of the Infrastructure Improvement Reserve Fund and declaring an emergency. Are there any remarks? Okay, I will go ahead and open it up for miscellaneous from my committee. Is there anything? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just for housekeeping, ordinance number 112-2024 will go 2 readings, you said? You wanted it to go 2 readings?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Anything from the body? From the gallery? Mr. Flaker? Good. All right. Hearing none, can I have a motion to adjourn, please?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. In a second?
I'll second.
All right. We are adjourned at 6:17.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. That concludes our individual committees this evening. With no objections, I'd like to roll right into the regular legislative meeting this evening.
Thank you.
Seeing no objections, we'll get this started. Today is Monday, November 25th, 2024. This is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. I call this meeting to order at 6:18 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mrs. Thompson.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we gather this evening asking for wisdom and guidance to make the best decisions for our community. serve with respect for all. Please keep our military and first responders safe and help us remember why we do what we do. In the Lord's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer,
Present.
Mr. Hyden,
Here.
Mrs. Thompson,
Here.
Mrs. Haber is absent, Mr. Cheatham is absent, Mr. Griffin,
Here.
Mrs. Beck,
Here.
Ms. Gerhart,
Here.
Mr. Harris.
Here. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, November 12th, 2024, as presented. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the approval of the minutes from the regular legislative meeting from Monday, November 12th, 2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidig's motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, November 12th, 2024, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. Approval of the minutes of the executive session held on Monday, November 18th, 2024, as presented. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the approval of the minutes of the executive session from Monday, November 18th, 2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidig's motion to approve the minutes from the executive session.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the executive session held on Monday, November 18th, 2024, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, the minutes of the executive session are adopted. Petitions and claims?
There are none.
Matters requested?
They've all been dispersed.
Thank you, thank you. Citizens addressing council. There were none last time I checked. We'll do one last call. All right, there are no public addressing council. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 108-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Appropriation Finance Department. An ordinance appropriating $134,497.31 from the unappropriated item of the American Rescue Plan Grant Fund to the capital budget of the American Rescue Plan Grant Fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Haber is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidig?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 108-2024.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 108-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidig?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Haber is absent. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 109-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Adopting the AFSCME Agreement. An ordinance of the Council of the City of Barberton adopting and approving the collective bargaining agreement between the City of Barberton and AFSCME Local 265 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Hager is absent. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 109-2024.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 109-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager is absent.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance 110-2024 is presented by Mrs. Beck. Title, enter into contract Kenmore Construction, Kenmore, Newell Street and Norton Avenue. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with Kenmore Construction, Kenmore, for Newell Street and Norton Avenue improvements for a total bid cost of $732,407.07 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Beck and second by Mr. Harris to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Ms. Hager is absent. Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance 110-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and second by Mr. Harris to adopt ordinance number 110-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mrs. Hager is absent. Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 111-2024 presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Grant Trust, America 250 Ohio Grants Program. An ordinance approving the submission of a grant request by the mayor of the city of Barberton to the America 250 Ohio Grants Program to be used for activities being planned in Barberton celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Hager is absent.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 111-2024.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 111-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager is absent. Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 112-2024 presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Non-Bargaining Personnel Policy. An ordinance adopting a new non-bargaining personnel policy 2025 and repealing all ordinance in conflict therewith. The emergency wording was removed approved by vote tonight, and at this, so we have taken it off, so this is as amended in the committee this evening. This will go for 2 readings. Okay, ordinance number 113-2024, presented by Ms. Gerhart. Title, amending ordinance 89-2023, approving 4-year 2023 CDBG annual action plan. An ordinance amending ordinance 89-2023, approving 4-year 2023 CDBG annual action plan to reflect an increase in the amount of $3,740.31 for a total contract amount of $73,740.31 due to an unforeseen issue with the roof located at 185 North Van Buren and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Ms. Gerhardt's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Ms. Gerhart and second by Mrs. Beck to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 113-2024.
Thank you. And Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Ms. Gerhardt's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Ms. Gerhart and second by Mrs. Beck to adopt ordinance number 113-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Hager is absent. Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 114-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, enter into contract Delta Dental employee dental coverage. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with Delta Dental to provide employee dental coverage beginning January 1st, 2025 through December 31st, 2026.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Cheatham is absent. Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager is absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 114-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 114-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager? And Mr. Cheatham are absent.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 115-2024, presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, amending ordinance 93-2024, appropriation street capital budget. An ordinance amending ordinance 93-2024, appropriation street capital budget to reflect a decrease in the appropriation amount of $500,000 for a total appropriation amount of $53,000 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion is made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham and Mrs. Hager are absent.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I vote for the adoption of ordinance number 115-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 115-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Cheatham and Mrs. Hager are absent. Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 116-2024 presented by Mrs. Thompson. Title, Appropriation Finance Department. An ordinance appropriating $447,000 from the unappropriated item of the Infrastructure Improvement Reserve Fund to the capital budget of the Infrastructure Improvement Reserve Fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham and Mrs. Hager are absent.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 116-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 116-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham and Mrs. Hager are absent. This ends the first reading.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries. Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and
We
resolutions.
have none.
Appointments.
We have none.
Miscellaneous and unfinished business. I'll entertain a motion to excuse the counselors tonight. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to excuse Counselors Hager and Cheatham from tonight's meeting.
Thank you. Is there a second? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to excuse Mr. Cheatham and Mrs. Hager this evening.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to excuse Mrs. Hager and Mr. Cheatham from tonight's regular legislative meeting. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, those members are excused. Is there anything from the body? Ms. Beck?
I wanted to kind of bring something up that happened last week. There was a bit of a ruckus about it. The ribbon cutting last week for White House. I want to kind of start off by saying I'm not a heartless person. I think you'd find it hard to find somebody who would say I don't have empathy. Secondly, I want to say I know that Vanessa does a great job. She's always on top of things. She has been personally helpful to me throughout this entire year. So when I say these things, I don't want it to come off as though I am criticizing her over what happened here. I understand that she had some health issues, had a rough week while she was trying to plan this. She planned it with another person through Summit County Board of Directors. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. All of council, all this year, have been asking to be invited to ribbon cuttings. This is nothing new. But this email that I received from her, saying, she apologized profusely for not being able to hold this entire thing up from a hospital bed. And I mulled this over all weekend after reading that. So this brought up another issue for me, that this person didn't have the support that somebody could take this off of her plate, that she had to do this from a hospital bed. And that's also very disturbing, aside from the fact that we have all been sitting here asking for this, asking to be invited, asking to be informed, that now I have to, I hear this, that she doesn't have the support for somebody to take that from her. And that's disturbing. But like I said, this didn't happen in a vacuum. And one of the reasons that this has bothered me so much this whole year, I'm also looking at this as from a perspective of having my own ribbon cutting ceremony. And I had so much support. It was overwhelming. So many people showed up. And I know it was because I sit in this chair and I talked about it. And I had the support. I know I have friends in your office. I know I had people that were excited for me. And that felt so good, because I put blood, sweat, and tears into that office, and it meant so much. I put my money into that. And I'm not exclusive of that as a business owner. And for me, I feel a bit embarrassed when I find out that happened and I wasn't there to offer my support to that person, to show my face and say, congratulations, I'm so happy for you. And thank you for putting your money into Barberton. That takes the opportunity away from us. But the bottom line is that it's hurtful to the business owner that they didn't get to see that. That is why I have been asking for it all year. It is not so I can stand in a picture on Facebook. I could care less. Photoshop me out for all I care. I want to show my face to that person. And that's what this is about. So it is disappointing that, that I find out that about this about Vanessa, and now feels like she has to apologize to me. That's not okay either. So I just wanted to use this because I said to people I was going to say something about it. That was prior to getting this email. Did it make me feel bad? Yeah, bad about being upset about that this person then thought I was thinking they were not doing their job well for a second, but then it made me angry that this person felt this way, and that by extension I made this person feel this way, and I'm not okay with that. So that is my piece on that, and I hope that we don't have to have this conversation anymore. I want you to know that is how I feel, and that is why I've been asking for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Beck. Is there anything else from the body? Mr. Haddock.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to make sure that when you spoke there, Councilor Beck, Vanessa has done above and beyond for any of us. Mm-hmm. And I never want her to feel like she ever has to apologize.
Yes.
There has never been a time I have asked for something and not been received of any of it within the most reasonable, more than reasonable time. Can't even use the word reasonable. She does a phenomenal job, and she has no need to apologize.
Indeed, I second that
Thank
sentiment.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Haddock. Is there anything else from the body? Ms. Garrett.
I guess I will also just acknowledge this too. I think had we been invited after being asked to be invited for a year, if we didn't get invited to one, it wouldn't have been such a standout. Like, it's the fact that we've asked for 11 months and continually are not invited and excluded from things that gets to be discouraging. So I agree.
I think that we would have said, oh, something's up here. That's odd. Not another one.
Is there anything else from the body? The only thing I have to say is happy Thanksgiving coming up. While it's not much, and it doesn't heal much, the Browns did win on one of the best Blizzard football games that I've watched in a while, so there's that.
Yeah, that was good.
I don't have anything else, just you guys have a happy Thanksgiving. Spend it with your friends and family, and forget about this as much as possible. Department heads, communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Councilwoman Beck, if I could address that for a moment. And I want all council to know that there has never been a time when we've purposely excluded council from anything, especially ribbon cuttings. You have to look at the context, and I know it may seem like it's kind of worked out in that way, that you feel excluded on purpose, but there's no malice. It's never been that way. Council raised a concern. We don't always schedule the ribbon cuttings. Obviously, we know about it before we're going, right? But we don't always get a heads up as quick as you may think we do. My concern when my assistant texted me that morning and said she was going to the hospital was not about a ribbon cutting. It was about making sure that my employee is healthy and safe, and what other things do we have to do to keep the operations moving forward. So there is support there, and now we have a kind of another plan in case that ever happens again. And we've had situations where multiple people are out, and how do we keep the operations moving forward? And one of the last things on my mind was making sure that anybody that had to be at the ribbon cutting was at the ribbon cutting, because my priority is my assistants, my employees, and making sure that they're healthy. She told me, hey, I've got my computer with me, I'll just start working from the hospital. I said, absolutely not. And I don't even know what the conditions were at that time, right? So no, you put the computer down, you worry about getting yourself healthy. So that's kind of the context. It's important. I appreciate you bringing this up, but it's important to know the full context. And again, like I said, we've got another policy where we're going to make sure that council is invited. And I did mention to you the other day, want to confirm it, but it's, what's that?
February 20th.
February 20th, W Construction on Norton Avenue is having a ribbon cutting. Again, I want to confirm that because I did not set that up. Vanessa did not set that up, and Ashley did not set that up. So I just want to confirm because it's so far in advance, because that typically does not happen. So, if you have any questions, please, let's talk. Kind of going along with some other comments made here at council, if you do see people blowing or raking leaves into a storm sewer, yes, please contact us. That can't happen. And we will, in the situation that was mentioned, we went out, we cleaned out the drain, it was definitely plugged. And the person was purposely putting leaves down our sewer drain. Obviously, we're working on this side to combat that, and to clean our drains and make sure everything is flowing. So the sooner we know about it, the sooner we can take action. And if it's using the police department, then we will, because an action over here could flood out someone down here, and they've done nothing wrong, right? So we want to make sure that we combat that. So if you see that, please report this as soon as possible. I do want to thank everyone who attended Change for Change last week. We don't have a total yet, but kind of going through the stats, the Change for Change and other activities that we've done since 2012, we've raised over $100,000 for nonprofits that directly benefit our community. So it's a nice win there and an easy way of, over time, collecting funds for nonprofits. We're continuing our collection of non-perishables and toiletries during the months of December and January. Also collecting monetary donations as well. Again, all of this will be donated to Backham and the Salvation Army. Please note, December 11th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. here in Council Chambers, we'll be holding a community engagement capital improvement night with the public to discuss capital projects for the coming years. This is something new we wanted to do to increase the awareness of what capital projects are and get feedback from the residents. So that'll be here on December 11th from 5 to 6:30. I'm continuing with budget and planning meetings for next year. And again, this will continue into the new year as we are working on plans for next year. If council has roads you'd like to consider for the 2025 paving program, please get those to us as soon as possible. We'd like to get those out to our consultant for estimated pricing for the roads, so we can start putting a more formal project together, a program together.
Quick question. Can you provide us with a list of, like, obviously, I'm asking because Ward 6 water line has been, the water main breaks have been going crazy. Can you provide me with, like, a list of streets that you're considering for water lines? That way I don't add them to my street paving list?
Yes,
I
so.
mean, I know some of the basic ones, but not all of them, I don't think.
Yeah, so we are, I think, out to bid for the 3 that we received funding for this past year. That's 5th Street downtown, Frank Avenue on the south end, and Wisteria on the southeast side. I'll get you a
I
list
know
of what we applied
Stratford's the
for.
main one that we're looking at, but I understand like Hagee, Maple,
Yeah, so
Union.
Stratford, and there's
Reese.
one other that we applied for funding for. That application process is usually June or July of each year. I think this last year, they had some issues going on, and they didn't accept applications till August.
Oh, yeah.
So we're still working on that. I know we've got some consultants that are kind of doing the design of several, so we can apply this next year. So, yeah, I'm not sure if we have a full list. But
Well, even a, you
Yeah.
know,
I'll get you something. that we're
partial
considering.
something.
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep. All right. Anything else with roads? Yes.
It was mentioned that with the Newell and Norton Avenue projects, has there been contact with the schools of a possible schedule for that?
Yeah, I mean, we stay in contact with the schools all the time. We always have. So I'm not sure where that comment came from, but the agreement or the contract tonight that you guys passed, that moves that along. Been working on the cooperative agreement with the foundation, the schools, and the city, and that's being finalized right now. So, yeah, they're always at the table. So, did you have any other?
Sure. I was actually in correspondence and discussion with the school today, trying to set up pre-construction meetings, talk through some of the schedule. Now that council passed tonight, Board of Control tomorrow will work directly with the contractor to quickly get it awarded, and so they can at least start ordering signals, equipment, poles. Those are the longest lead items, so we'd like to get started as soon as we can. Weather permitting, there's still some work that can be done before the end of school year, so that when school year is out, you're condensing in a very short time frame the concrete and asphalt that would be done and taking up the most of the maintenance of traffic in the roadway. So we've been hand in hand talking while we put plans together with the school. We actually have a lot of notes in the plan to coordinate directly with the school and a lot of the different activities. We're working to get the identified people from the school at our pre-construction meeting and weekly progress meetings so that they find out the information we do at the same time so that we can work together all the way through the project. So yes, we're working with the schools.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you know if 16th is getting a new water line?
I'm not sure if that's been under design yet. It wasn't part of the application process this past year. Just Stratford and one other street. I can't recall what that was.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
well, the goal, and I've mentioned this before, is to have multiple projects apply for funding, which means you have to have the design work done ahead of time so you get more points. So we've had a number of streets that have been looked at with the design that's been going on, but kind of exhausted the budget for the year. So as soon as we get into next year, get that budget passed, we'll get more roads under design for the next cycle. So, but that's why we haven't paved 16th Street, is because the water line's so bad.
That's why I remembered.
Yeah, we did some
that we
scratch
couldn't.
coats, some strip paving there,
Yep.
but the water line needs replaced. And part of it also is, we want to do the worst lines first, right? But the EPA is going to be coming out, is my understanding, to get away from 4-inch lines. So even though maybe it hasn't broken, we need to replace those 4-inch water lines at some point. Obviously, we want to do the ones that have been breaking first, so,
I just remember it's why we couldn't pave it, so that's why I thought to ask.
yeah. And some of that also is, because I'd like to pave 14th and 15th Street, 17th Street as well, but, get that Worcester Road project past those limits, and then cut down on the traffic that's cutting through and things of that nature, so.
Yeah.
This past Friday, we held a sign-up event for residents to apply for the Barberton Residential Services Relief Program, as well as the Summit County Fiscal Office Homestead Exemption. It was a great turnout. We're in the middle of processing those applications. We'll continue to hold events like this. We sent out quite a few through the mail. People called up, they couldn't make the event. So we'll continue to have those events and mail those out. So if you have any residents that may qualify, please let us know and we can mail them an application. You may have noticed the orange lights outside in front of the building. We're working with Zonta, bringing awareness to domestic abuse and gender equality. So today is their kickoff, and orange is their national color. So we made those lights orange for the day. And as we get towards the Christmas holiday lights here, we'll switch to green and red here. So I'd like to ask that you keep State Senator Kurt Scheuring and his family in your prayers. He lost his fight to cancer. He was an Ohio Senate Majority Leader out of the Canton area. Never oversaw Barberton, but I had some dealings with him. He really wrote the legislation on historic tax credits. Real true leader, working over the aisles with both parties, and really cared about improving the lives for everybody in the state. So he lost his life last week. So if you can keep him and his family in your prayers. I do want to thank the Barberton VFW Post 1066. They donated $12,000 to the renovation efforts at College Park, and that's moving forward as well. So you should see some activity there. The only thing that might stop some of that is the forecast, which is calling for a drastic drop in temperature and heavy wet snow. So we'll see what happens here in the next few days. It's really supposed to be Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're keeping tabs on the forecast and the temperature of the ground and all of that. But it sounds like it could get pretty nasty, but as we know, the forecast can change pretty quickly. So other than that, I want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. There's a lot to be thankful for. Please keep those in your mind and thoughts and prayers that are less fortunate, and remind everyone that the building is closed on Thursday and Friday this week. So, any other questions?
No, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't want to keep bringing this up because I know many of you guys mentioned it. This isn't something that's new when it comes to the ribbon cuttings. This is something that I've been talking about and asking for 3 years now. And it's not so much that council wants an invitation. Of course, we would love to be invited to the ribbon cuttings. It's more so just being aware of what's going on in the city, because I sat as the chair of planning for 2 years, and I can't tell you how many brand new businesses opened, and I had no idea about it until I saw it on social media. And I mean, unless they went through planning commission or design review for whatever reason, I mean, if everything's owned properly, they don't need to go through those avenues. So, just like Paula, my good friend Paula, who owns Cheers, I found out on Facebook that she bought White House, and that's just, I think if you guys are able to follow up with how, we celebrated this ribbon cutting, here's a photo, it would also be nice to just forward it to council, be like, hey, this opened today, or something along those lines, because I'm not on social media as much as I used to be, and I don't want to miss those things. And especially when I was chair of planning, it's sort of embarrassing as a council member, a representative for the city, not knowing what's going on in the city. You know what I mean? So it's not like we're upset that we didn't get invited. It's that we don't know what's going on. So that's what's upsetting. And I know that there's a lot going on, and it is just kind of an extra thing. I've made jokes about paying the $60 fee to join the chamber to get notifications for this, if that's what it takes. But I hope you know that it's not like we're mad that we didn't get invited. It's that we found out on social media that there's a new owner, or that a new business opened up, or Magic City, had their grand reopening, and that's all it is. Mm-hmm. So.
And as I said, we kind of revamped the policy or the procedure, so it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay. And I do want to remind those who have kids in the district, tomorrow is the last day before Thanksgiving break. We do also have Wednesday off for the schools for Barberton. That's it.
Back to Councilor Harris's point there, if you could give some sort of even rough list to everybody on council of streets that you're targeting for water lines, because you've known for years that I've fought like hell for Stratford, and after about 3 years, it finally came to light that, that you were looking for a total water line replacement. That's why it's kind of been pushed back, and I know we're still looking for that. But what happened after that was I had talked with some people that were riding me a little on Stratford, and they understood. As soon as I told them, look, I've been fighting, but it's come to my attention, we're trying to replace the whole water line before we do your road. That way we don't do your road and then destroy it with water main breaks. And they were ecstatic that that was, a possibility on the horizon. But before I knew that, they just kept thinking they're getting looked over and looked over and looked over. And I know there's not a hard, fast list. You saying this street and this street are the ones we're targeting. I know you've got all sorts of data points, but if there was a rough list that we could be provided, because residents do understand when you tell them your water line is 80 to 100 years old, I'm sorry your street looks like hell, we'll do what we can, but we really want to do it right. They are completely understanding of that, and it's so helpful to be able to tell them that. Right. So, like I said, I know you don't have a concrete list like this year we're doing this, and data always changes. You might have this street here, but this street here just had 6 breaks. Right. So now it gets moved, and you're dropping and moving.
Yeah, probably going to change over the winter time with the severity of the winter and new breaks that happen and things like that. Yeah.
But if there was just even a radar, so like I said, the residents, they get it. They'll understand. I've talked with them, but it helps us communicate to them. Hey, we're not ignoring you. In fact, we're trying to help you, right. And they're good with that.
Yeah, and with Stratford, I know you're talking about kind of in the past a little bit. This last year, we hand-delivered letters to every house and, try to save up on the postage because there's a lot of homes there, and it's a whole block from 31st to the dead end. So we try to do everything we can to get things out, whether it's social media and the paper, question and answer sessions. There's a lot of information flowing around, and we'll get you that rough list. And Todd has a good idea of what streets are 4-inch lines, and then obviously we've got the data behind the other streets that have blown up over the years with water main breaks. And it's interesting, I don't know the rhyme or reason, but there's streets that haven't been paved in 40 years, and the water line is older than that, and not a mark on the street. So there's a lot of things that happen kind of underneath the surface, whether it's the ground moving or the installation 50 years ago or whatever it is. But it's just interesting to see how things might pop over here on a relatively newer street, and over here you've got a 40-year-old street with an older water line, and nothing's wrong with the street. So similar to Worcester Road West, we didn't have any inclination that the water line was going to be bad because we knew it was old, but it was functioning until you started disturbing the ground on the south end of the street, and then it kind of started popping there. Yeah, but I'll get you that list.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Addick?
Thank you, Mr. President. Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. And Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd second that motion.
Second that.
It was moved by Mr. Addick and second by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Didn't think so. This meeting is adjourned.